And I was saying good morning to the people online. And welcome back. I want to spend a few minutes orienting us to the day and to the schedule and a little bit to forms, so we know how we'll be together and the sort of attitude in which we'll meet each other during the day. Some of you who have practiced with me before are familiar with my first instruction, which comes in the form of a question. It's how simple are you willing to let this be? We'll speak about various forms, but really it's in a way to assist us to sort of strip down ordinary life into its essentials. And so we talk and give instructions as if it sounds complicated, but really it's to simplify things. If the essence of all meditation practice, sitting practice, is to cease the manipulation of your experience in any way whatsoever. To stop manipulating, actually, is the essence of meditation. The kind of meditation that we're engaged in Zen is not a new yogic activity that you employ to gain a new result. It's the cessation of attaching to results and activities and allow yourself to rest in the basis of a pure awareness and consciousness. It's very similar to what, for example, a Dzogchen teacher would talk about, and resting in the natural great perfection. It's very similar. And almost every Zen retreat that I went to when I was training formally, the first instruction was pretty much the only instruction, which was follow the schedule. And the second instruction was follow the schedule. Follow the schedule, meaning begin this understanding of relinquishment, or even renunciation, if you want to call it that, of your own private individual ideas about how things should go, so you can let yourself rest in the container that we're developing together. It's not to deprive you of anything. It's to help us form a container that we share that will hold us in a warm way. Suzuki Roshi once said that renunciation isn't giving up the things of the world, it's just realizing that they all go away. So we'll follow the schedule, which will be posted, but you don't have to worry about the schedule, because I'll tell you what to do and when to do it. And if we were in a more formal retreat in which people were more familiar with the forms, you just follow the sounds and you know what to do. But I'll teach you what those are. For example, if you hear three resonances of this bell, if you hear it 3 times, that means we're sitting. That's the beginning of meditation. If you hear 1 strike with the bell, like you just heard, that means whatever we're doing is finished, and pay attention because something new is going to happen. If you hear it twice, like this, that means we're going to transition from sitting meditation to walking meditation. The meditation is continuing, but in a new form. When we do service, I'll use the larger bell. This suggests that we're in the Buddha hall doing liturgy or service. This bell suggests that we're in the Zendo, and a Zen temple, that would be a different room, sitting. So these are just little orienting things. And I'll use this lovely sound, that clunk of the wood, to help us when we do walking meditation. And I'll talk to you about that. You don't have to worry about doing things right or wrong. In fact, letting go of the ideas of right and wrong is really useful. And just see how it goes, follow along. Awakening is to be without anxiety about non-perfection. It's a funny way to say it, isn't it? Imagine living a life where you were free of anxiety of non-perfection. This isn't a practice of trying to be perfect. It's relinquishing the idea of perfection. So we'll sit together. We'll walk together a little bit. We will have some time for questions and answers. And other than those times, we'll mostly be silent. Unfortunately, I won't be silent. You'll have to put up with me talking a little bit because I'll be instructing you. And there is a lovely way to think about, well, let me back up. Everything is actually ordinary. Things become sacred because we treat them that way. Like when I was walking up to receive the incense to make the offering, you notice I didn't just walk up in there. I walked up to the altar and then I sidestepped into the space in front of the Buddha because that's a sacred area. So I wasn't doing it casually. And then I sidestepped away from it. We bowed as we entered in retreat. I did the 3 full bows to begin the day. It begins to make this place, if you want to call it, a sacred space. But it's also ordinary in some ways, but we're treating it in a different way. And that's how we begin to treat each other. And one of the ways to do that is, and now I'm going to put you on the spot since you're there on the end. Would you be my guinea pig for a second? You seem to be up for it. Okay, here's what I'd like you to do. Stand up and walk back out into the entry. I mean, not all the way out, just through the door. Okay, now, can you hear me? If I speak to you, turn around. But you can hear me, right? Okay. Now, you're going to enact what I would like all of you to do. You step across the threshold when you enter with the foot that is away from the altar. Which foot is that for you? Right, so step across the threshold, all the way, take step now, do a standing bow. And this is another form. This is gasho, this is namaste. If you put your tip of your fingers up about the height of your nose, about 8 or 9 inches away, and raise your elbows up a little bit, this is gasho. So feel the difference between this, it's lovely, heart-centered, and this, it's like, oh, now we're coming. It's an energetic kind of thing. Funny thing, if you're doing that, it's also because your sleeves are super long and you've got to keep your arms up in your row. So step back just for a second and do that again. Step in with the foot away from the altar, all the way in, full step, and do 1 gasho bow. Now that's how you enter the room. Then if you walk, if you want to do all the forms, and this will be helpful in walking meditation, the thumb of your left hand, put it in and then put it on your hara, put your right hand over it. That's how you walk. Okay? So now you're not just like flopping around. Now you're in a sacred space, and you're going to do something that's with some dignity. Then just walk to your seat, just walk around and face your seat. Walk around to the front of it and face it. Okay? Now he's standing there for a second, because he's now looking at the Buddha's seat. That's not just a seat, that's the seat where the Buddha is sitting. And so you naturally, step with it, you're not finished. Now you're gonna do another bow, because you're gonna bow to that seat. It's like, oh, okay, you honor your seat because you're gonna take it. Now turn clockwise. And even though these people aren't in front of you, now do another bow to the room, because now there's a whole room full of Buddhas, all these others. Now step back and sit on your cushion. it's a little ceremony. You've entered the space. It's like, oh, okay, now this is a special space. You walk to your chair, wherever you are, and shashu it's called. You see me walking, with it underneath my rakusu. And then you bow toward your seat, not to your seat. You bow toward it, indicating it's the seat of the Buddha. You turn in a clockwise way, usually because people are lined up. It's just Zen crowd control. So you don't bump into each other, and then you bow to the room. In this case, you'd be bowing this way, so you bow to the altar. Oh, this is a larger space. And then you take your seat. And now you've indicated that this isn't casual. It's not fussy. You don't have to, it's not harsh. It's just a little bit, if you allow yourself to experience a little bit of devotion. That's what it's like to enter the space in this way. Is that okay? Now, you'll forget. Because there's actually one more thing. Okay? Up for it? Okay? So just stand in front like you're going to do your bow. And your partner, what's your name?
Jessie.
So she's already sitting. Say you've already been sitting here, and he comes up. Now your job, without looking at him or anything, just to notice, oh, there's someone coming. So when you bow to your seat, you bow. Together. Now you've acknowledged him. But if you aren't sitting there yet, but you are, what's your name?
Marcia.
If you're sitting there, you would bow, because you're the one closest to him. And so, not only are you doing this small ritual to bring yourself in, you're now suddenly doing something super crucial in Zen practice. You're noticing everybody else, and you're responding to them. So you welcome the person who comes sits next to you, however far that is. You can sit down. Thank you. And I appreciate your willingness. Do you understand what I'm saying? Suddenly, because this is not a practice you do alone. Remember last night I was emphasizing the relationality? And this is how we embody it without even you don't have to think about it or make a concept about it, enact it with your body. This is what Buddhas do, is they respond to each other, they welcome each other, they honor each other, and you'll forget. It's a mindfulness practice, right? These are just mindfulness practices using your body. And when you forget, how about not criticizing yourself and saying, oh, I didn't remember. And now next time, it helps you suddenly begin to orient yourself in a way to each other. So you're treating everyone as if they're sacred. I had a fellow one time in a retreat who is a production manager for Dell Computers. It's a very high position. He makes these things happen, manages large teams. And he was in charge of taking care of the altar, which is, over a long retreat, it's more complicated. You have to keep the incenser clean, keep things up, change the candles and all that. Move things, dust. And he said after this week-long retreat, he went to work on Monday. And he put down his briefcase and he pulled out his laptop and he put it in the dock in his desk to start, and he realized he was handling everything just like he did with stuff on the altar. And then he went, oh, that's actually the point. Not to be fussy and precious, that's not it. But to be attentive and awake and aware and caring. So this is what we're practicing. If you don't do anything but just continue to practice in this sort of relationally responsive way, you're doing the practice. But it's like the info commercials, and there's more. I hope you don't mind me with my jokes. It's kind of fun, because otherwise we won't have any fun. And this is about the restoration of joy, not to make it light in a disrespectful way at all. Obviously, I'm asking you to be incredibly respectful, and also to respect our light heart, along with our very serious one. I think maybe that's enough on just the forms right now. I'll say more about some of their function in a little bit, but that will be quite enough. Why don't we actually just sit, and we'll do so for about 30 minutes. So get yourself organized so that you can sit with some comfort in an upright way. And if you need more props or anything, please do so. Am I going to mess up your camera if I come up a little higher? Good. The reason I was putting a little cushion under it's so much more comfortable to have your pelvis as if it's a bowl, like it's going to pour out the front. You know, instead of tipping back. It's because look what it does if I'm sitting back like a normal chair. But if I bring my pelvis forward, what happens to my sternum comes up? My heart opens, my shoulders fall back, and now I'm sitting upright, not like that. You don't have to crank your shoulders back. They don't need to do that. We'll do a little piece of yoga here, okay? Now, watch so that you don't hit your partner, because I'm going to ask you to extend your arms. I did this in England, by the way. Denise, who's one of our people online, she's in Liverpool right now. I met her in Switzerland. So with your palms down, be careful. One time I said in England, just make sure you don't bonk your partner. Well, you know what that means in England? Oh. I didn't realize that. Yeah, just give yourself a little space. And feel the stretch, a little across, just nice. Now, the magic. Roll your thumbs back. Oh, you feel the extra opening in your chest? Now, don't change anything about your posture at all except now put your hands down. Feel how upright you are? Feel what happened? It's a nice feeling. And you don't, if you keep, also our heads are like this with computers, so keep your chin back, because we cantilever are 8.5 pounds, usually about the head, and it hurts our necks. So keep it there. Just let yourself be relaxed and that sort of openness. You can put your hands however you'd like them. In traditional zazen, you'd use the cosmic mudra, in your lap, which you can do, but it's not required at all. And just sit. Just sit. The word in Japanese is shikantaza. Just sitting. And I may say a few things. We enjoy the sound of the bell to know that we're officially entering this period of sitting. I'll also say that in the Zen tradition, the instruction is typically to actually allow your eyes to remain open, to softly cast down. It's not, once again, required. But the reason I mention it is because it's an indication that we're sitting to remain intimate with life, not as a withdrawal from life. Not looking around, but just being present fully here, now. And if your awareness needs someplace to rest, allow it to follow the breath. Do you remember what one bell means? We're done with what we just did. Something else is going to happen. So now what's going to happen is our morning service. And as you can tell, I'm narrating almost everything we do because it's sort of training you in the forms. Exam. If we were finishing with our early morning sitting, our first sitting that we did, most of us wouldn't have rakusus on. They'd have them. And then you would do the verse of the robe, which would indicate that you're not going to put on Buddha's robes. This is a small version. She has it too. A small version of the bigger robes. And you can see all the little pieces? These strips are the same as the strips that are sewn together for the larger cases. So this is a small version of it. In our tradition, and the Soto tradition at the San Francisco Zen Center, we sew these ourselves. It's a very complicated procedure and lovely origami kind of thing. And when you finish it, you give it to your teacher, and on the back, it's plain white silk. But when you get it back from your teacher, there's all kind of lovely things that are on the back of it. And it's folded like this, and it goes in a little envelope, which I can show you. And this is kind of the funny part. When you do the chant in the morning, you put it in your head. Because the Buddha, nothing goes above the Buddha. So that's the Buddha's robe. And then you chant. So get your morning service out. And so we'll do the verse of the robe 3 times together. Ready? And all of us together. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. Wearing the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all beings. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. Wearing the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all beings. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. Wearing the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all beings. So once again, I'm going to stop and say things a little bit. This is a beautiful, beautiful verse, I think. And the first line, vast is the robe of liberation. What's vast? I mean, literally, what does it say? Vast is what? Liberation, not suffering. What's vast is liberation. And we're clothed in it. It's what we're wrapped in. It's this. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction, meaning it's basic goodness that we're resting in. And it doesn't mean it doesn't have any form. It means it can take any form. This vast, basic goodness is available to us in the myriad forms in which we find ourselves. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. Then wearing the universal teaching, wearing the teaching, not intellectual, not theology, not philosophy, wearing. You get it in your body by doing things, by bowing a certain way, by responding to your friends a certain way, by walking with them. You get it in your body. Wearing the universal teaching, I start to realize the one true nature. And that harmonizes all being. Not beings, all being. There's a harmony that begins to come from this. So do you see what it's pointing to? Because you enjoy some of the beautiful Asian forms here through your Tibetan practices and other practices, I'll show you what it sounds like in Japanese. If I was doing this chant, it goes like this. Great robe of liberation, field far beyond form and emptiness, wearing the Tathagata's teaching, saving all beings. That's like the literal kind of. But this is a poetic version that I think is quite wonderful. and to remind ourselves, vast is liberation, vast is the robe of liberation that we're cloaked in. This formless field of benefactor. What Trungpa used to call basic sanity, you know. Wearing the universal teaching. By our forms, we get it in our bodies. We realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all being. So if we did that in Zendo, put on our robes, and went to the Buddha Hall, now we're in the Buddha Hall, okay? And start the rest of the service, we start with repentance and confession. This is a trick that we play, is that you come and you think you're just going to sit, and suddenly like you're repenting? What the hell? You know? But it's different. Repentance and confession in the Zen tradition means, well, let's do it, and then we'll talk about it, okay? And you'll notice that the pronouns change in each form, okay? Here we go together. Ready? All my ancient tangled karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow. All our ancient tangled karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, we now fully avow. All the ancient tangled karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, all being now fully avows. All my ancient, or sometimes it's called twisted karma. I prefer tangled because it suggests that twisted sounds a little bit like sin to me, and I'm sensitive about that. All my ancient tangled karma, in other words, everything that went into creating this thing, from beginningless, greed, hate, and delusion, you know those three poisons, whatever, beginningless. Guess what, folks? It's not your fault. This is what it means to come into form. You're a karmic creation. All my ancient tangled karma, from beginningless, greed, hate, and delusion. But now, number 3, born through body, speech, I do carry it. In my body, my speech, my mind, I'm responsible for it. And so what do you do in the last line? You stand up in the middle of your life and you say, yep, this is me. Not I'm a lowly sinner, not I'm a terrible person. I admit who I am and what I am. And that admission is a powerful turn. We're trying to run from it, change it, fix it, deny it, look good, hide. Everything we do, say, no, I'm willing to stand up, I'm willing to sit upright like we do and say, this is who I am, and this is what I'm going to work with. This is what I have. This is my spiritual life in this body. And it starts out, now I fully avow. And then we avow, because it's shared. And last, all being now fully avows. We're joining into the fullness of life, this beneficent field that we just chanted in the robe chant. So you can see that this repentance and confession is very different, isn't it? You know, with the foundation, most of you that have done some Christian theology stuff, you know what repentance means, right? What does it mean?
Turning away.
What's that? Turning around. Just turning around. Well, you're doing that all the time in here. But you're turning in a different direction. And the different direction we're turning in is one of self-responsibility and deep self-compassion and care and kindness and wisdom, rather than assuming that you're always doing something wrong. You may be off the mark, which is what sin really means, but coming back is a different thing. So what do? Well, you start by the confession and repentance, which says, okay, I'm willing to look at myself. But then once you do, if you're not going to follow your conditioning, you know, like your beliefs, your ideas, your family patterns, if you're not going to follow all that, what do you follow? Well, refuge. That's what's next. Okay. So let's say the refuges together. Here we go. I take refuge in Buddha. I take refuge in Dharma. I take refuge in Sangha. We take refuge in Buddha. before all being, immersing body and mind deeply in the way, awakening true mind. We take refuge in Dharma, before all being, entering deeply the merciful ocean of Buddha's way. We take refuge in Dharma, before all being, bringing harmony to everyone, free from hindrance. Now all being has completely taken refuge in Buddha. Now all being has completely taken refuge in Dharma. Now all being has completely taken refuge in Sangha. Such a great sound, isn't it? I meant your voices. We put our faith in things that are not worthy of our faith. We put our faith in what we think and what we feel, and the histories and narratives we've been told about who we are, what our family is, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, what it means to be white, what it means to be some other color. We put our faith in all these ideas, and those things are not worthy of our faith. What's worthy is the field of awakening, which is Buddha, the way awakening unfolds in life, which is Dharma, and the community of people that are helping us do this, which is Sangha. And that middle part, where it says, we take refuge in Buddha, before all being, immersing body and mind deeply in the way, awakening true mind. This before all being bit, there's two ways to read it. Like, in front of all y'all, south. Like before everyone. But actually, more deeply, its meaning is before we create the self, before selfing, before all being, immersing body and mind deeply in the way, resting deeply in the and when we say Buddha, take refuge in Buddha, we don't mean take refuge in a statue or some old guy in India. We mean our nature. We take refuge in who we truly are before we make a personality. And that's immersing ourselves deeply in the way. That's awakening who we truly are, true mind. And take refuge in Dharma, the way things actually work. Before all being, we enter the deep, merciful ocean of Buddha's way. And then thirdly, before all, we take refuge in, oops, it's wrong. It should be Sangha, I'm sorry. I don't know why I miscounted that third one. It should be, we take refuge in Sangha, before all bringing harmony to everyone free from hindrance. It doesn't say we harmonize everybody. It says we bring ourselves forward as harmony, not completely encapsulated or in our hindrances, which we are going to carry. By taking refuge with each other, we help each other. And that's, we're going to talk about the precepts, which really gives us some, a way to follow this. And then the last recitation is, in invoking these things, my own practice, I take refuge, in our shared practice, we take refuge. We are echoing the wakefulness and the lawfulness and the relationality of the entire universe. All being takes refuge in Buddha. All being take refuge in Dharma. All being take refuge in Sangha. And I know I'm going over this briefly, but I want you to get a feel for it, for what we're actually doing. That these have deep, deep meaning, not just esoteric repetition. So we start by coming to practice, willing to look at ourselves and admit who we are. If we're not going to follow our conditioning, we're going to follow something different in practice, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And then we're going to embody it, which is actually the robe chant, which you already did. And then we need to take it out into the world, which is our last chant for the morning service, which is Bodhisattva Vow. We have to take it out into the world. So, Here we go with our voices once again. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them all. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them all. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. Beings are numberless, we vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, we vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, we vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, we vow to embody it. Beings are numberless, this vow frees them all. Delusions are inexhaustible, this vow ends them all. Dharma gates are boundless, this vow enters them all. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, this vow embodies it. So did you notice anything just from a rhetorical point of view about these vows? Start in the beginning. So there's numberless beings in the world and you vow to free them. That's not possible. Every one of these is impossible. And that's why they're a vow and not a goal. Goals can be achieved. Vows cannot be achieved. They're endless orienting streams of energy and devotion that will stay with you and be available to you forever. They continue to pour themselves out for you if you offer yourselves to them. And like the North Star, that will guide you continuously. And we start out by saying, beings are numberless. My vow is to help people find some freedom. And delusions are inexhaustible, Lord knows. But I do vow to end them. And Dharma gates, which means opportunities for awakening, are endless. I vow to utilize them, step through them. And Buddha's way, the way of awakening, is unsurpassable. That's why we're here. So I vow to embody that. So we use these embodied practices to do it. But in the second recitation, we remember, this is a shared activity, isn't it? We are vowing to assist each other in freedom. We're vowing together, by our being here together, to end delusion. And we're vowing to help each other step through the Dharma gates, which are open to us all the time. And we vow to embody as a community, as EBS is vowing to embody as a community the way of awakening in the world. And then the last one is the one that just gives me chills because it's so beautiful. Beings are numberless, this vow frees them all. If we take this vow seriously and embody it fully, just taking of the vow, when the Buddha had his enlightened experience under the tree, he said, now all beings are free. Well, wait a minute, the world was the same. What was he saying? That from his perspective of awakening, he could see the freedom that's inherent in everything, even in its messed upness. Delusions are inexhaustible. This vow ends them all. Dharma gates are boundless. This vow enters them all. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. This vow embodies it. This vow embodies it. This vow embodies it. I say what we are messy miracles. And because we focus more on the mess, we forget the miraculous part. Because we get so identified with our stuff. And yes, we have to attend to that. But it's in the space, all that is arising and passing away, impermanently and interdependently, in the space of perfect fullness. Like that quote from Suzuki Roshi last night, we live constantly off balance against a background of perfect balance. We live constantly in our messiness against this background of that beneficent field of goodness. And both are true at the same time. That's that paradoxical stuff we were talking about last night, So as we're chanting, these aren't just old chants that we're doing, these are profound teachings that and as you chant them and you get them in your body, if we were doing a long retreat, this is rather brief, and I wouldn't be talking all the time. We'd just be doing it. But it gets in your body and it starts to run on its own. Some of you have had that experience, right? There are practices that you do and things you remember, and they start going on their own in you. This will happen. See if there's anything else I want to say. You know what I think we should do? I think we should go through the whole service again now without me talking.
Okay.
Okay? So now you have an orientation. I've walked you through it. Now let's stand up. And if I move over here, will I still be on camera? Which way?
Yeah, there you go.
This way. Perfect.
Okay, good. For the people online that way. And we're going to do the robe chant even though we would do it usually sitting in the zendo. And I'm gonna, you know me, I can't help myself. There's one more thing. If we were in a temple, a Zen temple, there would be a piece of wood hanging outside. They have a verse on it. And it's hit with a mallet. It makes a really loud noise. It's a way to signal people to come to the zendo that don't have an iPhone 1,000 years ago, because it makes a loud noise and it penetrates a long way, and you can hear it across an old monastery. And there's a verse that's written on it. And so whenever it's hit, that sound is the verse being sent out into the universe. Great is the matter of birth and death. All is impermanent, quickly passing. Awake, awake, don't waste this life. It's called a Han. Great is the matter of birth and death. All is impermanent, quickly passing. Awake, awake, don't waste this precious life. That's what calls you to the zendo. Every single morning, every single day. So you hear this, it's a 15-minute different repetition of sounds. But once you know it, you know, like, oh, there's the second roll down, I only have 5 more minutes. And you get to the second roll down, it's like, oh, I'm late. I have to wait outside, you know, after the priest gets, it's a timing device. But it's telling you all the time, we're here to practice with the great matter. Because everything is impermanent, it's passing. So don't go back to sleep. Remember Rumi? Don't waste this precious life. Very Oliver. So, first of the robe, 3 times. Okay? Vast as the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction, wherein the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all being. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction, wherein the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all being. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction, wherein the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all beings. I take refuge in Buddha. Did I do it 3 times?
All my ancient
Oh, sorry. Yes.
All my ancient tangled karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow. All our ancient tangled karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, we now fully avow. All the ancient tangled karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, all beings now fully avow. I take refuge in Buddha, I take refuge in Dharma, refuge in Dharma before all being, entering deeply the merciful ocean of Buddha's way. We take refuge in Sangha before all being, bringing harmony to everyone, free from hindrance. Now all being has completely taken refuge in Buddha. Now all being has completely taken refuge in Dharma. Now all being has completely taken refuge in Sangha. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. Beings are numberless, we vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, we vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, we vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, we vow to embody it. Beings are numberless, this vow frees them all. Delusions are inexhaustible, this vow ends them all. Dharma gates are boundless, this vow enters them all. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, this vow embodies it.
Isn't that how life is? You think you have it down and then it changes. Oh, a surprise. Walking a little further, expanding your horizons a little bit. You know, finding our way home, which is the theme. On the everyday level, there's like resilient coping, which is a really good thing. Resilience is wonderful, and having capacity to cope with the world is a really effective thing because the world is constantly changing. But that only goes so far. And taking refuge and having a pattern to follow, like the precepts, is about finding our way home on a spiritual level, not on the mundane level. And yet they interact. We're always returning. You always come back to your seat. Because the other part of our title, you know, finding our way home, walking the bodhisattva path when our world is spinning, well, the world's always spinning. There's always some thing that's being thrown in. And the practice is how to help us navigate this kind of world, because there's not another kind. There's not another kind of world. This is the one we got. And this is the way it always goes. So this is what our practice offers. You know, I spent 45 years pretty much as a psychotherapist. And in doing so, I worked with tons and tons of people and saw how beautifully they would learn about themselves in a self-reflective way, make wonderful changes in terms of resiliency and coping. And it really benefited them quite a bit. And I also saw that often in those situations, they would get so involved in that wonderful process that they'd get very caught in the self-reflection and self-identification process that goes with that kind of work. And instead of like endless self-help, looking for the next thing to work on. It was useful, but there was a limit because there was no practice to be able to actually reflect on the thing they were calling a self. Then I spent the last 25 years or so in monasteries and temples training, and I would see people who would study the Dharma, practice it, understand it beautifully, even teach it remarkably. And when they sat, like you're sitting, in silence for long periods of time, and stuff comes up, no idea what to do with it. And let's say the idea or the recommendation that you sit more is not helpful. with the stuff that comes up. Think about it. This is a thumbnail sketch, I know, but everybody has bad stuff happen to them. But it's not all trauma, it's just bad things. What makes it trauma? When you can't speak about it, and you can't move or do anything about it. What do they tell you in the meditation hall? Sit down and shut up. Don't move and don't talk. So if somebody's carrying trauma and this stuff comes up, and it says sit more, that's brutal. Unless there's other things to go with it. But you put these two things together, the growing up part of psychotherapy, you know what I'm talking about, the regular stuff, resilient coping, and the waking up part, non-dual practice, you put those two things together. Then you have what I'll call the double helix of growing up and waking up towards maturity. That's the function. This is about being mature as a human being, fully awake as a human being. One of the last generation of Japanese teachers, he never came to the United States, Uchiyama Roshi. He did learn English somewhat, and he taught a lot of English speaking, or let's say Western students. A lot of German students came to see him also, and in Taiji, Japan. And one time a student asked a question like the one I mentioned last night that David Chadwick had asked Suzuki Roshi, the one where you know the answer, but you want to know what the guy's going to say, or the woman, whatever. And so the student said to Uchiyama, "What's a bodhisattva?" He knew what a bodhisattva was. And Uchiyama said in his broken English, "I think a grown-up." And so we're always speaking about these two sides of the coin, the growing up and waking up, the mundane and the sublime, the relative and the absolute. If you land on one side, you're not going to have the whole picture. And say, if you can try to hang out in the absolute, like some people do in spiritual practice, and they end up losing deep, warm human connection. You can't hang out in enlightenment. And if you just stay in the everyday, you lose what I call the embodied inconceivable. What you can realize in your body, but you can't conceive of. But you can express, and you can receive, and you can become a light for yourself and for others in that way. They go together. One of the things that we're not using here, but we chant in the liturgy in Soto Zen, is translated in English, the title. It's translated as the merging of difference and unity. Like that's all of practice. How do you integrate the relative and the absolute, these two sides of the reality that we're living in? Because it's always pulling us, and it's always a little bit confusing, these two sides. You cannot create awakening, and you cannot achieve it. You personally can't, because it's already accomplished. It's already the reality. You can realize it. And so, Dogen, who developed the Soto tradition that I'm ordained in, his primary question was, with this stuff we're talking about, if we're already awake, if that's our nature, why practice? It's a lot of bother. And yet, our teachers say practice like your hair is on fire. Give it all you got. Dedicate your whole life to it. Uchiyama, the guy I mentioned about grown-up, his teacher was Kodo Sawaki Roshi, who was a real innovator, but he's kind of one of those wild guys, like you, And he would say, because so many Western students wanted to come to him, to Sawaki. He was called Homeless Kodo because he didn't have a temple. He would travel around. And he would say, "Why do you want to sit zazen? All you people are coming out. Why? It's a waste of time. Sitting like this is just a waste of time. And if you don't dedicate your life completely to this waste of time, your life is going to be a waste of time." He's playing two sides. You can't create awakening. It's the uncreated. But you can realize it. And realization is what we put our energy and our effort into, to realize what's already true. You don't create it, you realize it. And that's what it's like. That's why the word enlightenment has been used a lot. It's like turning on a light and you see what you couldn't see before, but it's always there. It's like, whoa, it's right in front of your face all the time. And teachers point to it and do all kind of crazy things and try to help you understand, but it's not intellectual, and you're not going to finally go from being the not so great unenlightened person to now the really good enlightened person. You're going to be the same person, but you're going to be awake to what this is to be a human being. And guess what? The most important thing, you're going to see everybody else that way. And if you look around and you look carefully with real wisdom, what you see is folks are having a hard time. It's not all, but you see it, right? That, if you look clearly enough and see that folks are having a hard time, that naturally begins to open your heart a bit. And if you're willing to hang in there with the hard time you're having and everybody else is having, and not blow out, because it's difficult, that willingness to meet suffering and not turn away is called compassion. And if you hang in like that, you're going to see more deeply. That's called wisdom. And they start feeding each other, wisdom and compassion, in this very practical, everyday way that we try to help each other. Don't worry about esoteric Buddhist teachings. It's just we're going to help each other by seeing where people are struggling, hanging in there, compassionate, opening, helping us see more deeply. But that takes a lot of courage. A lot of us are afraid of being seen deeply, or afraid of seeing what's actually around us. And so it takes a lot of courage. So that's why we hold each other up and help each other and encourage each other. This awakening thing that we can't create, we can't realize, also happens between, not in us. Not just between people. Between it. It's a function that's happening as a result of everything together. It's not something you get. If it was something you could have, it's like, well, now I've got it. That would be an object that you could have as a separate individual. That doesn't make any sense based on the Buddhist understanding. It makes no sense at all. But we start shifting our spiritual practice to think it's something we can attain and have. And that's not true. It's an alive, dynamic, contingent reality that's always flowing already. And you can step into that stream. And we do it by getting quiet and still. And doing simple things like walking together, which seem like nothing. Until you do it for a pretty long time with other people with these kinds of attitudes, and suddenly something begins to change. You begin to realize, what's happening. What's always been happening. And what's possible. So last night I talked about in the Zen tradition we have this practice, path, and vow. We kind of touched on each of those things a little bit. And hopefully we're beginning to realize this is embodied and relational. It's not esoteric out there somewhere. And there's really only one form. The one form is Zazen. Zazen is not just the sitting, it's the essential presence and fullness of presence in each moment that we enact by our sitting. But there are a lot of entry gates. One of them is sitting, Zazen or other kinds of meditation, either alone or together. Another entry gate is our walking, which is a continuous enactment of Zazen together as we move. Alone and together. All of them are alone and together. Another gate is chanting, using our voices during the service. This is expressing the teachings with our voices and with our ears. They say chant with your ears, meaning listen, accord with the other people. So it's both alone and together, bowing. It's a profound embodied expression of the Buddha's way. It comes to bow to a little square of fabric, like you're doing, and into the room. It seems, you know, like why are we doing this? But it's expressing something really profound. And study. Some of the things I talk about and some of the things that I suggest. Both old Dharma teachings and contemporary ones. We begin to, how is this expressed now? One of the reasons why I don't usually come in the full deal is because, number one, I'm not Japanese. I'm American. This came from Neiman Marcus. and I don't, my job isn't to be a fake Japanese or a fake Tibetan or fake, you know, I want to be completely myself and not water down the teachings, but to infuse them with life in this culture, at this time, in this world, in Little Rock, Arkansas, so that it can make a difference somewhere. And of course, the other last real intricate is relationships, student-teacher, or a spiritual friendship. Doesn't have to be student-teacher. And ultimately with all beings. Those are the intrigates. This afternoon, we're gonna start really taking a look at the precepts themselves. I'll talk about that a little more. Before we break for our lunch, are there questions or comments, or like I said, complaints you might want to register at this moment?
I like that you mentioned why practice.
The question, why practice?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a profound question. I was talking to somebody about it maybe a month or two back, and they were a patron at the place I work. And we got to talking about that I meditated. Another partner meditates. So, why do you guys just sit there and do nothing? So, well, you know, eventually it helps you unlock, seemingly unlock different, you know, you can hear things. You can listen instead of just waiting for your turn to talk. You have a little more patience. You do things differently, right? And she says, but if you already knew to listen to somebody before they talk, or when they're talking, instead of waiting for your response, why didn't you just do that? Why do you need to practice? And I sat and I thought about it, and I didn't think about it, and I thought about it again. And eventually I came up with, most people know how to do a push-up, but you're not going to get strong unless you practice. So that's the end of my story.
The short version is you get good at what you practice. And most of us practice judging, thinking, self-doubt, self-hate, criticizing, being afraid. You practice all kinds of things. You're practicing all the time. If you want to know what you're practicing, look at your life. People say, you know, what are you willing to die for? That's what you're doing all the time. Because that's where you're going. If you want to know what you're practicing, just look at your life and it'll tell you. If that's not the life that you want, then there are alternatives. And you get good at what you practice. So if you want to practice deep listening, practice deep listening. There are things that we do in longer retreats sometimes that we've borrowed from things like Quakers, for example. I'll give people a pithy question, something to really chew on. They'll sit with it, they'll do a little journaling, and then I'll say, okay, I'm going to pair you up, and I want you to, we're in a retreat setting, go out and take a walk. And for 15 minutes, I want person A, you, to just speak about what's going on, what you know, and if you're quiet, you're quiet, but the other person says nothing. They don't ask a question, there's no clarification, they're just listening. And if you're quiet, they hold you in quietness. At the end of 15 minutes, you switch. You start talking. He listens to you, or you're quiet. For that half hour, that's the way it goes. Then for the third half hour, then you can talk. And it goes really differently when you speak to someone and no one's asking you anything, it goes differently than even a nice warm conversation. And it teaches you some of the stuff that you're talking about. And slowly you begin to have a different appreciation of what practice can bring us. I don't have it in front of me, but I'll read you a couple of the ways that Dogen talked about this question. It's like if we're already awake, what's the deal? That's a good question.
I have one too.
Yeah.
I'm really cheered up by how we figured out how to walk.
That's great, wasn't it?
I mean, we started out and I thought, what a bunch of bad walkers.
It's always that way.
I know, but it just makes me so happy. It does. I just wanted to cheer.
Yeah, I know. It was great, and I thought, wow, this is so lovely. Everybody's flowing. Let's let the flow spread out. And even when you go through doorways where it's tiny, you know, we have to relate to each other.
Yeah.
Can we keep going, you know?
We went right with you. We just
Yeah, I knew it might be a little surprise. So I said to Kathy, follow me. You know, just keep going. I assumed the person behind her would follow, you know.
It was great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yay, us.
Yeah.
The Bodhisattva cheer. It's always really quiet. The Bodhisattva cheer. So I have a question. We're about to break for our lunch. And I think, let's see, how long do we have? We have an hour, right? And we'll be here. Do you want to eat in silence, or do you want to have some time to talk to each other? I don't mind either way. I thought since we have such a short retreat, it might be nice to say hello to each other. And it actually adds an additional practice. Going in and out of silence is harder than just staying in silence. Because you get kind of ramped up back into relationality, and then you have to come back and you begin to feel, because the practice shows itself not just when you're doing the sitting or walking or whatever. Practice reveals itself in transition. When you have to change, then you see how you manage that. So let's do that. Would that be okay?
I have a question. Are there any vows for a meal or for eating?
Oh, like a meal chant? Yeah, there are various ones. There are long ones and short ones. I'll show you the short one, the shortest one. So in this case, you know, the three treasures, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Okay, here's the short version. Listen. We revere the three treasures and give thanks for this food, the work of many people, and the transformation of other forms of life. You like that one? Okay. Say it with me, only I'll give it to you a little at a time. Call and response. We revere the three treasures.
We revere the three treasures.
Give thanks for this food.
Give thanks for this food.
The work of many people.
The work of many people.
And the transformation of other forms of life.
And the transformation of other forms of life.
Is that good? Yeah. I'll show you a longer one later. Okay. You guys are online. Enjoy your meal. Whatever time of day it is, whatever you want. Dogen from this morning. The question about practice. When Dogen was lived from 1200 to 1253, and early on he went to China because he didn't think he could find the fullest expression of the Dharma in Japan at the time, so he traveled with his teacher to China at great peril. And while he was there, his teacher that went with him died. But he found another teacher that he wanted to study with. And when he returned, the first thing he wrote was called the Fukan Zazengi, which is fun to say. Which means the universal instruction for Zazen. And let's see, did she just go to the restroom? I guess she must be.
Yeah, I think
She'll be
so.
back in a moment.
She'll
Okay.
be back.
She's heard this. So at the beginning of this piece that he wrote, as soon as he got back to tell people, here's how it starts. The way is basically perfect and all-pervading. How could it be contingent upon practice and realization? The Dharma vehicle is free and untrammeled. What need is there for concentrated effort? Indeed, the whole body is far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? It is never apart from one, right where one is. What is the use of going off here and there to practice? So there's the question. And yet, if there's the slightest discrepancy, the way is as distant as heaven from earth. If the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost in confusion. Suppose one gains pride of understanding and inflates one's own enlightenment, glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things, attaining the way, clarifying the mind, raising an aspiration to escalate the very sky. Whereas all that stuff happens, one is making the initial partial excursions about the frontiers, but is still somewhat deficient in the vital way of total emancipation. So he's saying, why do we need to practice if it's free? But you know what? If you don't, it only takes a little bit and you're not going to. So I'll read a little bit more. This is not our text, but it's pretty good. And he says, need I mention the Buddha, who is possessed of inborn knowledge? The influence of his 6 years of upright sitting is noticeable still. Or Bodhidharma's transmission to the mind seal. Bodhidharma supposedly was the figure who brought Buddhism from India to China. Or Bodhidharma's mind seal, the fame of his 9 years of wall sitting is celebrated to this day. Since this was the case with the saints of old, how can we dispense with the negotiation of a way? You should therefore cease for practice based on intellectual understanding, following words and pursuing words and following after speech, and take the backward step that turns your light inwardly to illuminate yourself. Body and mind of themselves will drop away and your original face will be manifest. If you want to attain suchness, you should practice suchness without delay. And then he starts giving instruction. But this whole thing in the beginning kind of gives you a feel for that question you're asking. Here's one more little piece. A few years later, he wrote a letter to one of his students. I'm going to read a little bit like I did just then. Imagine getting this in an email. Because that's basically what it was at that point, you know. As all things are Buddha Dharma, there is delusion and realization, practice, birth and death. They're Buddhas and sentient beings. So as all things are Buddha Dharma, there's these both sides. Okay? As the myriad things without an abiding self, there's no delusion, no realization, no Buddhas, no sentient beings, no birth and death. The Buddha way is basically leaping clear of the many and the one. And there are birth and death, delusion and realization, sentient beings and Buddhas. In other words, he's saying, on the one hand, if all things are Buddha Dharma, it's free. There's emptiness, there's vastness. But because there's no abiding self, that's a no abiding self, but we see that there is delusion, realization on the other hand. And what he's saying is, awakening is jumping past both of them. It isn't enlightenment, it isn't endarkenment, it's stepping beyond. The Buddha way is leaping clear of the many and the one, not going from the many to the one, not going from dualism to non-dual. That's a very dualistic view. And guess what? In that leaping, there's birth and death. There's delusion and realization. There's sentient beings, because that's the world we live in. He says, yet in attachments, blossoms fall, and in aversions, weeds spread. In other words, impermanence happens. To carry yourself forward and express myriad things, if you think you're doing it, that's delusion. That myriad things come forth and express themselves is awakening. And then I'm going to skip down because I don't want to go too far into this. Here's the most famous thing ever from Dogen. You hear this everywhere. Step by step, sentence by sentence, there's like 5 sentences. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, body and mind, the self and other drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So to study the Buddha way is to study this thing that we create. And when you study it deeply, you begin to loosen your identification with this thing we think is solid. You don't forget the self, it starts coming apart. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. You realize you come into being because of everything else. You're not making the world's making you. And when actualized by myriad things, he says your body and mind as well as the body and mind of others drop away. That doesn't mean things disappear. It means, oh, it's not the way you thought it was. Those things you take as separate and unique, and this and that don't look exactly the same. No trace of realization remains. In other words, you don't have something you've got, remember, like you open to the embodied inconceivable, and that no trace continues endlessly. So this is just some kind of wild language, but the dude was plugged in. He kind of knew what he was talking about because he practiced very deeply. So I thought I would share that. Because it's really the classical language around most of the stuff I was talking about this morning. You have your handout? I want to say a few things before we get to it, but this finding our way home, that, walking the Bodhisattva path when the world is spinning, the finding our way home part that orients us, I was saying, are the refuges. The refuges are indicators to say, this is where we're going to focus our attention rather than all the stuff that's going on in your mind. We're going to take refuge. So, like when you're using GPS to find your way back, that thing that says current location, that finds you, that's the refuges. That's like, oh, I'm here, I'm situated here. And then walking the Bodhisattva path are the precepts, and that's GPS, that's the goodness positioning system that allows you to know. And if you get off, it says recalculating, that's practice. It's just so you got an idea what we're doing, But look, more seriously, the precepts are the one essential piece that you see in lay ordination, called Jukai, and Zen, priest ordination, and Dharma transmission, and marriages and funerals. Every one of those ceremonies in the Zen tradition, the precepts are offered. Because they're the one abiding, they're basically the whole thing. They're the essential part of Zen practice. And this ethical and moral orientation that the precepts provide is the defining distinction between secular mindfulness and spiritual practice in the Buddhist tradition. You can use mindfulness in lots of ways, including to do bad things, because there's not a moral valence to it. Mindfulness used in Buddhist practice is specifically a religious or spiritual practice that's an ethical orientation because it's aligned with the goodness for all beings. It isn't just paying attention more carefully to do a better job of the thing you're doing in the world. And mindfulness has been extracted from the precepts and used in a lot of useful ways, but it's not Buddhist practice because there's no precepts. Did I hammer that in hard enough? And you see why I'm saying it? It's not Buddhist practice. It's mindfulness practice, but it's not Buddhist practice because there's no precepts. There's no ethical foundation. So in the beginning, when the Buddha began to teach and then ordain monks, it was new. He was this teacher who had been a prince who had come out of the Hindu tradition. There was no Buddhism. That got created later. He was teaching out of his own experience. It's, in a comparative theology point of view, it's kind of interesting. The Buddha is to Hinduism what Jesus was to Judaism. There's no Christianity. Jesus was a Jew the whole time. But he taught in a way that blew out from Judaism and did something different. Buddha, same way. Hinduism. So you'll see in your handout this thing called In the Buddha's Words. It's 5 gifts. Okay. So when he began teaching, and that means people began to follow him, that means people gathered together, and guess what? Oh man, you had people together. Those of you that are familiar with Christian scriptures, the gospel, it says, wherever 2 of you more are gathered in my name, there I will be also. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Methodist minister, and we've done Buddhist Christian retreats together, and I said, you know what that scripture really says? It says, where 2 or more of you are gathered in my name, the shit will hit the fan. Right? That's what actually happened. So the Buddha had to develop precepts. They weren't Buddhist, they're universal. And they're in every spiritual tradition, but this is the way. To protect the community as well as the minds of those people who are practicing. So this is one pretty good translation in a very classic way. And so let's read it together, because this is how it had been done in the past. You would say these things and read it together. And I know it's a few paragraphs, but what the heck, Let's use our voices. And she came back just in time to read with us. Oh, you need something? Need to come retrieve your handouts, because we're going to be using them. I mean, you could always look on, but and you missed the Dogen part. But I figure you were pretty familiar with that. Okay, we're going to start where there are further amongst these 5 gifts. Got that? Okay. All together, we're going to walk through this with our voices in our ears. Okay. There are further amongst these 5 gifts, pristine, of long-standing, traditional, ancient, unadulterated, and never before adulterated, that not being adulterated, and they will not be adulterated, not despised by wise ascetics and Brahmins. What are these 5 gifts? Here, monks, a noble disciple gives up the destruction of life and abstains from it. By abstaining from the destruction of life, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. By giving to immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression, he himself will enjoy immeasurable freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. This is the first of those great gifts and 4th stream merit. Furthermore, a noble disciple gives up the taking of what is not given and abstains from it. By abstaining from taking what is not given, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear. This is the second of the great gifts and the fifth stream of merit. Furthermore, a noble disciple gives up sexual misconduct and abstains from it. By abstaining from sexual misconduct, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear. This is the third of these great gifts and the sixth stream of merit. Furthermore, a noble disciple gives up false speech and abstains from it. By abstaining from false speech, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear. This is the fourth of these great gifts and the seventh stream of merit. Furthermore, a noble disciple gives up wines, liquors, and intoxicants, the basis for negligence, and abstains from them. By abstaining from wines, liquors, and intoxicants, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and aggression. By giving to immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and aggression, he himself will enjoy immeasurable freedom from fear, hostility, and aggression. This is the fifth of those great gifts and the eighth stream of merit. These monks are the eight streams of merit, streams of the wholesome nourishments of happiness, which are heavenly, ripening in happiness, conducive to heaven, and which lead to whatever is wished for, loved, agreeable, to one's welfare and happiness. Thought it deserved a bell. So you see that I have the little ... for the fear, hostility, oppression by giving fear. That actually goes with each of those sections. But what are the five gifts? What's the first one?
Not killing.
Don't kill. Right? Abstains from the destruction of life. What's the second one? What's that? Not stealing. Right. Don't take what's not given. Third? Yeah, misusing sexuality. Fourth one? Lying. A popular one these days. And the fifth one? Not intoxicating. Right. So these are the five basic precepts that you see in almost every spiritual tradition. Don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, don't misuse sexuality, don't intoxicate yourself and other people. I just wanted you to kind of hear them. And what it gives people, he said, is freedom from fear, from hostility, from oppression. And that by practicing it, you're also free. But it's a gift. It gives something to people. It's not just for your own benefit. So the precepts are very different. Kathy and I were talking about this morning. Very different than the commandments. Because they don't say, now do this and don't do that. It says, if you take a vow not to lie, for example, then you're going to start noticing all the ways that you lie. Or you're not quite true. Or you withhold information. Or and you're going to start paying attention. And you're going to start choosing what seems wholesome, what seems unwholesome. If there was just a rule, do it and don't, that's somebody else telling you and you just follow them. But now this is harder. Now you have to live with it. There's a great story. by, it comes from the history of William Penn, Pennsylvania. So he was obviously a gentleman of quite high rank, whatever, in the 18th century. Wasn't it? It's the 1700s when he was, yeah. So he converted to being a Quaker as an adult. But then he got to feeling weird because he was a high-ranking person, he wore a sword when he was dressed up. So he went to his teacher and said, what do I do about the sword? Like, it's a violent thing, and I just have moved to this spiritual path that's profoundly nonviolent. And being a good Zen teacher, his Quaker teacher said, wear it as long as you can. Isn't that great? He didn't say, oh, don't worry about it, it's just like an accessory. And he didn't say, yeah, take it off because it's violent. He said, no, see what it's like to live with it. And what do you learn? That's the precepts. And make a choice. Find out deeply what it means. So instead of a rule, right, wrong, good, bad, the precepts are like a trellis. If you have a plant that's growing that needs that kind of thing, if you don't have a trellis, it just kind of falls in on itself, it doesn't do anything. But on the trellis, it doesn't go like, it doesn't follow it exactly, does it? It finds a place to hold on, and then it flourishes. And it finds another place to hold on, and it flourishes. And then it can grow and become itself because it has something on which to grow. But it's not following it rigidly, but it's also not just on its own. The precepts are like that. Does that make sense? This beautiful trellis that we can grow on. Kind of a scaffolding. And so the precepts are much more challenging than just rules, because you have to live with. And with mindful awareness, you're going to pay attention to what it feels like to meet or not meet these things. Not so you feel guilty or sinful. Is it wholesome? Does it actually feel good? Does it free you from fear, hostility, and oppression? And does it give to other people a freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression? Do you want to be responsible in that way? Does that make sense? Any questions about that part? So that's the orientation. Now, when I studied the precepts in the beginning with my teacher, Blanche Hartman, she gave me the next thing by Kobanchino. You see that yet? Koban was one of those first generation of Japanese teachers who came to the United States. He actually came to help Suzuki Roshi do stuff. He was a bit younger. He was a wonderful teacher. He's a poet. And you can hear it in his language. So when I started studying the precepts, this is all Blanche gave me, is this book. And she said, begin to write basically a journal on the precepts of how you begin to find them in your life and how you're practicing with them. But listen to this piece. The main subject, and then he used a Japanese term there, which I changed, which is denko-e, which means taking the precepts and the bodhisattva vow. The main subject of the precepts and the bodhisattva vow is how to become a transmitter of actual light. Life, light. Practice takes place to shape your whole ability to reflect the light coming through you and to regenerate your system so the light increases its power. Each precept is a remark about hard climbing, maybe climbing down. You don't use the precepts for accomplishing your own personality or fulfilling your dream, your highest image. You don't use the precepts in that way. The precepts are the reflected light world of one precept, which is Buddha's mind itself, which is the presence of Buddha. Zazen is the first formulation of the accomplishment of Buddha existing. The more you sense the rareness and value of your own life, the more you realize how you use it, how you manifest it, is all your responsibility. we face such a big task. So naturally, a person sits down for a while. It's not an intended action, it's a natural action. I don't know about you, but that's knocked out, this whole thing. The main subject of the precepts is how to become a transmitter of actual light. So the light of awareness, the light of basic goodness, is what you're offering in the world, who you are. So people, and you know that when you're with people like that, they're like, when I went to see lots of teachers, Zen teachers, Tibetan teachers, Vipassana teachers. I went to IMS, all these places, had great teachers. And I found good ones. There's fantastic teachers around. And when I chose Blanche and thought I would ask her if she would be my teacher, when it was when I watched her leave service, which we're doing almost none of it here, formal service, and she took off her bowing cloth, put it on the thing, and did her bows, and the way she oriented to the altar. What's that? It's not what she did. It's how she did it and who was doing it. There was a dignity and an immensity to this simple act done by this older woman that whatever that was, I wanted that. And I studied with a bunch of teachers and a bunch of smart men, and it's like, well, I'm one of those. I don't have to be more than that. There's something else here that I need. And she represented it in her body. She was a transmitter of light, of actual life light, in that moment. And I wanted to know how to align with that. Practice takes place to shape your whole ability to reflect the light coming through you and to generate and regenerate your system. So the light increases its power. That's part of what Joko was talking about when I mentioned become a large container. So that the immense energy, the almost frightening energy of life itself can flow through you fully for the good of the world. And then I love this. Each precept is a remark about hard climbing, maybe climbing down. In other words, not climbing up. You're not ascending to anything. You don't use the precepts to accomplish your own personality. There was one time when Suzuki was talking to one of his students, and the student was talking about how much they'd gained during their retreat. And he said, good, don't use it. What? Don't make it into a thing that you think you have and then use. Let it do its thing. It's not about accomplishing your own personality or fulfilling your dream of your highest image, including your highest image of a good Buddhist practitioner. No, that's just spiritual materialism. That's the next thing to go for, the next merit badge. You don't use the precepts in that way, he says. The precepts are the reflected light world of one precept, which is Buddha's mind itself. Let's read it backwards. Buddha's mind itself is the one precept which gets reflected in the world, which is the presence of Buddha. In other words, the precepts are not things you do so you will become a Buddha. The precepts are a reflection of what someone who's awake, how they act in the world. If you're awake, you don't kill things. If you're awake, you don't lie. You don't steal. It wouldn't come to your mind. They're the reflection of goodness. They aren't something to achieve and then you become a good person. This is another one of those turnaround things, like we've been talking about. Completely different than the way we're trained. Is this making sense? And Zazen, the sitting thing, is the first formulation of the accomplishment of Buddha existing. What a sentence. In other words, when you sit in Zazen and you take that posture, you bow, you sit there, it's a small ceremony. It's not meditation. Dogen says later on in this thing that the Zazen I teach is not meditation. It's the Dharma gate of repose and bliss. In other words, it's a small ceremony. We bow to our cushion, we bow away, we sit down, we take a posture, we're engaged in a ceremony to express our innate wakefulness, which we have some faith in, even if we don't feel it. If you sit full of awakening, Zazen has no preference for awakening. If you sit full of delusion, Zazen has no aversion to delusion. Zazen is Buddha's mind, which holds and reflects everything exactly as it is without preference. And we sit as a small ceremony to say thank you for this wakeful nature, which is what we come from and which we'll return to as we come into form and then go out of form. So it isn't an activity we're doing to create something, and yet it takes our wholehearted effort to do it, right? You feel that. And sometimes, especially after lunch, when we're just doing nada yoga, you know, that kind of sleepy one. Zazen is the first formulation, it's the essence, it's the one practice of Buddha existing. When you sit like that, you are expressing yourself as Buddha. So you're saying Buddha exists. And it exists in me like this funky, messed up one. Yeah, that's how Buddha looks. It looks like this. And it looks like that, and that, and that, and that. The more you sense the rareness and value of your own life, the way you are, the more you realize that how you use it, how you manifest it, it's all your responsibility. So you face such a big task, it's natural to sit down. And so we practice sitting down. And he says it's a natural action. It's not like you have to intend it. And you, all of you, probably, most of you have had enough spiritual practice experience where there are some teachers you meet, or teachings you meet, or moments you encounter where if you don't sit down, you're going to fall down. You're going to be knocked down by it. It's so powerful. And so this is all I had in beginning to start the precepts, but it's pretty good. It's really beautiful. There's another piece in the sutra book here. Computer's so literal. I feel one letter off, you know. I have to read this to you because it's so beautiful. You realize, I hope, by now, that when I'm teaching, what you're witnessing is my practice. The edge I'm practicing on. I'm with you. I'm just taking this role. It's just a function. I'm not a teacher. I'm taking on a role or function called teacher. But I'm practicing with you. And so as I get enthusiastic about this stuff, you can tell, it matters because that's the edge I'm practicing with. Kobin was a wonderful man. He also taught in Switzerland, in the mountains, where I taught for 10 years each year. And he married late in life. Japanese monks can marry, and had a young child. And so they were at this beautiful center. And his little girl, who was 3 at the time, they were there, and she fell in the pond that was there. So he went in to get her, and he had his robes on, and they both drowned. They both died quite young. It's a sad kind of thing. Previously, before that, he and some of his senior students were there. And Carolyn Etchison, who's one of the senior students, wrote this. She's describing a moment in that zendo, at that place. We sit. Kobin began speaking to us very slowly. we sit to make life meaningful. The significance of our life is not experienced in striving to create some perfect thing. She said he looked down at his hands as he spoke, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he continued. We must simply start with accepting ourselves. Sitting brings us back to actually who and where we are. Again, he waited as he perhaps reflected on his own life. This can be very painful, he said. Self-acceptance is the hardest thing to do. Once again, he paused so long at this point that I wondered if perhaps he'd finished. But finally he continued. If we can't accept ourselves, we're living in ignorance, the darkest night. We may still be awake, but we don't know where we are. We cannot see. The mind has no light. He stopped and looked around at us in our small circle. He moved from face to face with his eyes seeing deeply into each one of us. His longtime oldest students. Finally, he nodded slightly and concluded, practice is this candle in our very darkest room. It's hard to get through. It's a very poignant expression. The way I would say it also is that I take your longing for awakening seriously. This isn't like a nice thing to do on the weekend. This really matters. And you're wanting to do it matters to me. And I want you to have everything, not a little bit. That's why I give you too much. I know, but I don't have much time with you, so, and who knows how much time we all have, you know. So I resonate with that spirit that he was echoing about this light, you know, and about what the precepts offer us as a possibility. What are you noticing as I read this kind of stuff? Just say a few words. What are you noticing? How would you describe, what are you present to in this moment? What? Some kind of love? Devotion? Mm-hmm.
Peace. Peace.
Some peace?
Humility.
Say again?
Taking responsibility.
Taking responsibility. There's a tear that fell.
Humility.
Humility? Uh-huh.
Impermanence.
Say again?
Impermanence.
Impermanence? Uh-huh.
Sadness. Sadness.
Sadness, uh-huh. There's that grief that's the price of love that I was talking about. There's a kind of a poignancy, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Not because this is all sad, it's not. Of course, there's the joy. But this matters. And we know we only have a little time. And we're doing the best we can. And we see how hard it is for folks. Once again, that sense of compassion begins to arise. And it's worth taking time to notice and to pay attention and to care for each other in that way. Let's see here. Really, I'm supposed to stop at 3? I don't think so.
You mean for the whole day?
No,
No.
the Dharma talk, I was just looking at the schedule. Is it okay if I go a little longer?
I don't know.
Are we doing all right? Okay.
Yeah.
I was just looking at the schedule to see how much time we had, and I've just yacked on too long.
No.
Let's look at Joan Halifax, okay? Who wants to read the first paragraph? I'd like someone to read, so they don't listen to me all the time. Okay, so would you stand up, just so people can hear you well? And why don't you, if you stand over here, and he will guide you, and then you'll be in the camera. So the folks who are online can see and hear you too. Am I in the way, or can they get her?
No, you're good. There you go. Perfect.
Here.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Good.
you're standing.
The precepts were and continue to be a living body of awakening, a way to be Buddha now, and a treasure for our lives as social beings. The Buddha knew this, and as he lay dying, he gave his disciples 3 recommendations. He encouraged them to realize the truth of impermanence so they could let go of their worldly attachments. He asked them to be guided by the precepts so they could stabilize their own minds and live in harmony with each other and all beings. And he encouraged them to be a lamp unto themselves, that is, to take full responsibility for their lives. He realized that living a clear and honest life would be a basis for their liberation from suffering, and that if his successors had strong moral character, their minds would most surely open to inherent natural wisdom and compassion. That is, they would be Buddhas too.
It's very encouraging, isn't it? Why don't you just go ahead and read the rest of it? There's not that much more. Just step back over there.
When we receive the precepts today, whether we are monks or lay people, we let them open our lives to a deeper truth that we are not separate from each other. Through living the precepts, we can discover that we are linked by the bonds of suffering as well as the bonds of enlightenment, and in this way recognize that we share a common body, a common life, and a common aspiration for happiness and peace.
Thank you. I thought that was such a beautiful encapsulation of the practice of precepts now, how it came to us, and what it means in our everyday practice now. Any questions about this? Seem to be.
One of the things that strikes me is there's an embodiment of a certain kind of integrity in that, and our culture is so starved for.
I think that's actually the perfect word that I use quite a bit, is the integrity. Things hold together in a wholesome way. Absolutely. It's exactly what it's called for, and what we see a paucity of these days often, and the consequences of that lack. And it's quite clear. And it's quite easy then to become reactive or judgmental, and then we're right back in it. And yet, it's really important to pay attention and to find a way, as I said last night, that Bodhisattva's job is to take each moment, each situation, each relationship, and see if there's some way to just turn it a little bit more towards goodness, towards awakening, in the smallest way. In the Lotus Sutra, it said, our job is to shine one corner of the universe, not the whole universe, just our little corner where we can do our job and do our best within the limits of our own capacity and our reach. That was the end of the quotes, right? And then I gave you that long, complicated thing on the precepts, right? Okay, that was sort of an interesting overview. That we can take a look at. just briefly. I have some other ways I want to talk about the precept, but we might save it for tomorrow. So do you have them in, you don't have them in color, do you? Okay? So if you look at the B on every one of them, it will say the prohibition, because often you hear the precepts in the prohibitory way. So you see, no killing, no stealing, no misusing sexuality. If you just go down the row and whatever the number is, B, then no lying or deceiving others, no clouding, that's intoxication, no blaming or criticizing, no competing or coveting, not to rage, resent, or seek revenge. So there's more than just the 5. But what's interesting about this is there's the inspirational part of it. That's A. No killing because there's no separate self. You're killing yourself. No stealing because there's no scarcity of resources. No misusing sexuality because love is abundant. No lying because there's no need to hide the truth. No clouding because there's no need to hide from the truth. No blaming because there's no victims or perpetrators in the larger sense. No competing or coveting because there's no winners or losers in a non-dualistic world, and don't do all this angry stuff because there are no mistakes. And then you look at the keys in bold. Gratitude, generosity, love, honesty, awareness, kindness, humility. That's like the gifts that come. So I thought this was a really unique way to look at the precepts. There's more in there. But it really opens them up, including E on each one, which is the vow. Like with the no killing. I vow to take up the way of supporting life. Number 2, I vow to take up the way of taking only what is freely given and giving freely all that I can. On number 3, on sexuality, I vow to take up the way of engaging in sexual intimacy respectfully and with an open heart. Number 4, about lying, I take up the way of speaking truthfully. 5, about intoxication, I take up the way of cultivating a clear mind. 6, about blaming, criticizing others, I take up the way of speaking of others with openness and possibility. 7, I take up the way of meeting others on equal ground. That's a great one. That's one we need right now. And then 8, I take up the way of letting go of anger. It doesn't say you don't have it. You're going to have it. Letting go of it. So this is quite a nice curriculum. And let's see. A couple of technical notes just because they're fun. The term nature that we use, like true nature or Buddha nature, in Chinese is Xing. I don't know the exact symbol, but Xing is the pinyin way of doing it, which emphasizes patterns of relationship, activity, and energy. So our nature isn't like a personal thing. It's a pattern of relationship and activity and energy. Our original nature then consists of actively orienting relationships in response to ending suffering or whatever trouble is manifesting that day on the news, in the pattern of interdependence among everything. So our true nature isn't a quality we have, it's an activity of orienting to aligning and helping things be in accord. Does it make sense? And I thought this was interesting because our language is so different. And the Chinese made it very different than the Indian. Given this, there's no situation in which we cannot express our own nature. Conducting ourselves as bodhisattvas involves humbly exhibiting a complete and unreserved readiness to be of service in the realization of awakening. In the Chinese way of thinking, the pattern of all things, or reality, the Tao, that's the Taoist part, must be allowed to circulate freely. So our true nature is this free circulation, this larger space. Peter Hershock, which we mentioned last night, he talks about awakening being the relinquishment of 3 horizons. This is an interesting idea. So what is a horizon? It's an apparent boundary, right? You look out and you think, oh, there's the horizon. But then if you move, what happens? You know, I live up high, like at 1,700 feet on the side of a mountain in Hawaii, and you look out and you see the ocean and the sky. It's like, oh, there's the horizon. But it keeps on moving. It's not actually a thing. It's an apparent thing. And there are 3 resolutions of horizons that we think are lines that we have to begin to let go of. The first one is readiness. You know, I'm ready for this, but I'm not ready for that. Yikes. You know, letting go of this horizon for readiness. And we can go on, I'm not going to go on about this very long, but you get the idea, right? Oh, like I can handle it. Second, our relevance. This is important, but that's not. I don't have to pay attention to that. Like, well, so what's relevant and what am I ready for? And the third one is responsibility. What am I going to be responsible to? Not responsible for everything, but, and that we think there's a line like where I am, like I can't deal with. That's not relevant. That's, you know, no, I'm not ready for that. Or I can't be, it's like, well, as you open, those things fall away. And that's where improvisational virtuosity allows us to move. See, in Indian Buddhism, I'm taking a look at my notes because some of this is a little more dense, but in Indian Buddhism, wisdom or prajna from India meant knowledge of the cessation of all the influxes. In other words, our mental and sensory world, which creates thought and feelings and reaction to apparent things, is trying to stop all that. We're going to stop doing those things that make problems. It meant realizing a state of consciousness free from impure influences and defiling activity. So that's a common thing we understand, right? And stop having all that bad stuff. But Chinese Buddhists generally referred to prajna as je oui, a compound word literally meaning realizing quick-wittedness and prudence. Not stopping being sinful, basically. Wisdom in this case, then, is not so much a matter of knowledge about the nature of things or realizing the cessation of unwholesome influences, but of responsive virtuosity. Wisdom is an embodied function of appropriate responsiveness, not an idea or understanding of something. Wisdom isn't the idea or understanding of something. Wisdom isn't the idea or understanding of something. It's an embodied function of responsiveness. That's wisdom. So that's why I went over that, because it's really important. Dogen, when asked what is the mind of enlightenment, said intimacy with all things. Meet each thing as it is. 3 centuries later, Unman was asked the same thing. What's the mind of enlightenment? He said, an appropriate response. So can we receive the world and be intimate with it? And can we respond to it appropriately? We're concave and we're convex. We're receptive and we're expressive. And that dynamic, living reality that's free is what awakening is about. So we'll talk tomorrow, that's more about conduct. Tomorrow we'll talk more about vow. Vows transform contemplation and meditation from abstract musings about stuff to a driving force of a lifetime. That's a vow. Let's take a break. have a period of zazen now, and throughout the day, I've offered sometimes some instruction or encouragement during zazen, and it might be useful this afternoon because this is like the sleepy time. But it's good to have the period of silence and stillness within which I've had more than one request to speak a little bit about this interface in my own life with Buddhism and Christianity, because I keep referring to these things. And so I'd already mentioned this, Kathy this morning was asking me about it. I may read a little piece that I wrote about that in our sitting, just to touch on that little piece, since many of us are from these kinds of backgrounds. But it'll just be an encouragement of the same kind that we're doing. Would that be okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's begin our sitting now. There's a beautiful little poem by Basho that I sometimes use in memorial services, but I'm looking at this. It's very short. The temple bell stops, but the sound keeps coming out of the flowers.
Mm.
1928, in a small community, logging community outside Monticello, Arkansas. In 1931, he was 3 years old. The family moved to Texas, where my grandfather finished his high school education so he could become a Southern Baptist preacher. Many years later, as a young boy, myself, at a small, dying church in Austin, Texas, I watched my grandfather. It was called East Avenue Baptist Church. That's where my story begins. I remember sitting in the front pew of East Avenue Baptist Church on Sunday morning as a young boy watching my grandfather preach. When he finished and it was time for the invitation, he would ask us to join in singing the old hymn, Just As I Am. The church was too old, too small, and too poor to have a minister of music, so he would point us to the right page in the hymnal, and we would sing along as he spoke during the chorus to those in the congregation who were ripe for conversion. I was a serious little boy, having grown up in the Southern Baptist Church, and I was always moved by that song, by the earnest request of my grandfather, or any preacher, who was suggesting that this was a life-saving opportunity, the pinnacle of spiritual transformation, to come forward and profess your faith in Jesus Christ and thus be assured of salvation. The music was emotional and solemn. Just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou biddest me to come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come. I come. Some of you know these words. The invitation touched that place in me, and I'm sure many others that longed to be called into a relationship in which they would be fully seen, completely accepted, and infinitely loved. Only God was capable of that, we were told. And if we were willing to come to him, quote, just as I am, all would be well. And this was all fine and good during the Sunday morning service, but in Sunday school the very next week, the story mysteriously changed. Apparently I wasn't okay just as I am. In fact, it was probably a good idea that I should actually offer a plea to be forgiven for who I was. I could come home, but there were rules in this house, and the entry into the kingdom had a big price. The truth slowly dawned. Being seen was a bit risky. Being accepted was definitely going to be conditional. And being loved just as I am finally seemed impossible. After all, I knew I was different. I was gay. I was a really good boy. I did what I was told. I was polite and smart. I had my perfect attendance in Sunday school pins, and I was a royal ambassador. I memorized the 23rd Psalm and repeated it in my father's Sunday school class when I was 5 years old, and was baptized when I was 6. I knew what it took to make it in this world of religion, and it meant following the rules and pleasing the big people. I knew I could do that, and I was good at it. The only trouble was, I had to maintain certain secrets in order to keep it up. Of course, I also began to notice that most of the people in the church had their secrets too. And one of the rules we shared was not to notice. It became clear that looking good was sometimes more important than being good. So I became good at that. Over time, the hidden parts grew too large. The pleasing became too much of a burden, and the disconnection too great. I left the church, but just as I am did not leave me. It kept working on me. I became a psychologist and practiced as a psychotherapist. I dedicated my life to relief of suffering in others, and in particular, I was devoted to helping people find a way to accept themselves, just exactly as they were. If change was possible, this was the starting place. I studied, trained, practiced. I found my place in the field of behavioral medicine with a specialty in cancer care, working in hospitals and cancer treatment centers around the country. These were real life-saving opportunities, or at least life-affirming and healing opportunities. But one big thing was missing: a spiritual path. Psychology only went so far, and these patients were facing much more than passing anxieties or depressions. They were not just struggling in their marriages or fighting with their children. These people were facing the possibility of a foreshortened life. And they were living with pain and suffering that was very apparent. I needed spiritual help in my own life and new tools to support my patients. I also needed a break. Work in cancer care can be very demanding, so I finally took a vacation to Hawaii, hiking the beautiful and rugged Nepali Trail on the north coast of Hawaii with a friend. Along with the needed supplies to sustain our trek, I took along a copy of the Dhammapada, one of the earliest texts of the Buddha's collective teachings. The 11-mile hike along the narrow trail to our campsite was demanding, but the scenery was unbelievably inspiring. The combination of fear and awe left me in a rare state as I finally sat on that remote beach in the Kalalau Valley, reading the unfamiliar words of this ancient Eastern teacher. Ordinary life had dropped away as I traversed the switchbacks through the hanging valleys along the jagged coast. As I walked, I was held up by the vast sky above me and called forward by the seemingly endless ocean reaching out to the horizon. Something true was being revealed to me in the raw power of nature, and more subtly on the pages of the slim volume I carried in my backpack. Here I was, just as I am, without much to prop me up or fall back on, no one to impress, nothing to hide. I stood naked under the waterfall to take my shower, rested in the shade of the rainforest canopy to eat my meals, and took walks along the beach with the shorebirds scurrying along beside me as my companions. And when I returned home, I began to slowly find my way along a new spiritual path. This landscape was characterized by mindful awareness, profound acceptance, and deep gratitude for all that is. I studied and learned all I could about the Buddhist teachings. I came to see that his only concern was the cause of suffering and the relief of suffering he saw around him. That was what I was interested in, and what my patients needed, relief from suffering. I meditated and went to retreats. I found a mature teacher to guide me and friends to accompany me along the way. I started a meditation group, founded a Zen center, was ordained as a priest, spent time in a training monastery and practiced in Japan. Eventually, I allowed a good bit of all the ancient Asian forms of practice to fall away. Now I teach the same freedom from suffering, just as I am, in this body, in this time, in this culture, under these circumstances, right here. And along the way, I turned back to the actual teachings of Jesus and discovered that what the young boy could not have seen, that this freedom was what the Jesus story had been about all along. I now understood that the yearning to respond to that call, to be seen, to be accepted, and to be loved unconditionally, was a universal desire, not a Christian or Buddhist desire. Everyone wants to be, quote, saved, no matter what their spiritual tradition. Saved from a disconnected life that is not their own. What was touched as I sat singing that song of invitation was the soft spot in all of us. And it was this tender place that Jesus and Buddha had recognized and met with their lives. They responded as compassionate healers and wise teachers, and their kindness has made a profound difference in the world over the past 2 millennia. As a result, I now have the opportunity to live a life of truth, just as I am, held in the radiant light of wise care that these great teachers demonstrated in their lives. And you have that same opportunity too, just as you are.